Prime Minister, Jean-Pierre, dear Prefect, ambassadors and representatives of French and foreign diplomats, departmental councillors, mayors of Vienne and mayors of Châteauroux and other cities, elected officials, business people, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Vienne. I'm very proud to open this great geopolitical meeting for the Fondation Prospective and Innovation for the second consecutive year. Welcome to this emblematic place, this very important meeting place in our department. Thank you, Jean-Pierre, Prime Minister, for your continued confidence in the Vienne department and for continuing what René Monory started when he was the leader of our department, when he created this foundation. Thank you for always working for your homeland, for Vienne. Thank you for continuing to foster these values and for putting our beautiful region, Poitou-Charentes, under the spotlight. I also would like to thank some participants who are here today and those of you who are following us remotely in France and elsewhere. We are very close to the Futuroscope, which René Monory baptized the European Park back when it opened, and we've come a long way since it opened in 1987, but I would like to say it is just as French as it is European, and it's even an international destination with more than 50 million visitors. And in the past 25 years, we can say that our department is very proud of this destination. And when Thierry Breton was there with René Honorary when the park opened and has continued to advocate for Vienne and for Europe. I also would like to thank our current Vienne leaders who continue to work for our department, and I also would like to applaud all of the people who work for our park and work for Vienne today and in the future. So the disruptions that we see here and what we're living today show that we live in a fragile world. The difficult summer and hot summer that we've just passed brings that home. We also see that through drought and energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, and other difficult issues, even beyond 20 years ago, President Chirac already said that, yes, we have to look elsewhere, but we also have to look inwards. We local leaders, national and international leaders, all have to think about it. It is incumbent upon us, France, our role in Europe and the world, and it's important also for our towns and for our department. The department plays a key role in the lives of our citizens, and we've seen this recently because at the local level, we come up with solutions, we discuss and listen, we work with our citizens, and we achieve results. We are there for our citizens, and that it has proven to be a winning formula. It's important to not forget that the essential is urgent, when sometimes we urgently forget what is essential. And a world that does not reflect is a world that does not advance. And all of these disruptions are what bring us here today. All of this turbulence is an inherent part of our social, economic, and political lives. And all too often, it's people who suffer. I obviously am thinking about our Ukrainian brothers and sisters who have been living through a very difficult situation for the last 6 months. And I think a year ago, we would have had a hard time believing that it could happen. We've seen that there's a lot of uncertainty that have been brought about also by the pandemic. Our fellow citizens feel like their world is crumbling, that we see that a lot of people feel that leaders are incapable of solving problems. So we see that there's also a sort of paralysis. People are not listening to each other, whether it's at the local or international levels. And we need to change course. We need to use the tools we have that work at our disposal. We need to reconnect with the land, and that's how we will find a solution, a balanced solution that helps everyone in Europe and elsewhere. And that's what I hope for Vienne. That's what I try to do every day, and I call upon everyone to do the same. We need to put our citizens at the center. And that's what's at stake, because if local communities are left and are abandoned, well, then everyone suffers. And if we do not band together at the local level, there's no way we can be strong at the international level. So I call upon everyone to find the path of trust and balance, work with local communities to be players, active players for change. Jean Bonnet said about change that people accept change when they have to, and they only see the need or what they have to do in times of crisis. So let's not wait for the next crisis to act. Let's accept that things are changing, that our world is constantly evolving, and we need to adapt our behavior appropriately. We need to change the way we govern. We need to anticipate. And I believe in our Republican values more than ever: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. Our national motto reminds us always that we are a nation of local cohesion. We need to be the #1 ambassadors for these ideas locally and internationally. We need to defend these ideas that sometimes run away from us. We need to remain lucid and clear-eyed and write a new European chapter with local communities in the idea of peace and reconciliation. All of us, each at our level, we need to heal the divides. We need to re-sow the rips and tears to build a lasting peace between nations. Ladies and gentlemen, our future has a future. Thank you. Your final words, I'm going to remember your final words. Thank you, President of Vienne, and thank you for really saying what maybe we should think about today is, can disruption be a catalyst for change? So thank you for saying it. And as dear President just said it. Today's meeting is being held in a very difficult, pessimistic, and sometimes tragic context, because today Europe has been shaken to its roots and is really, there's a lot of upheaval that has come about by the war in Ukraine. The tragedy that the Ukrainian people are living is definitely one thing, but also a lot of people are there are a lot of trickle-down consequences of this war, such as inflation, the food crisis that will affect the most fragile nations, especially in Africa. And later we will hear from Tertius ZONGO, who will talk about some of the issues that are going to affect the social fiber of Africa well beyond the Ukraine. And also when we talk about European sovereignty and defending Europe, is an idea that has mobilized a lot of people, but there are a lot of people in Europe are afraid of war hitting their doorsteps. In France, we are, in theory, very afraid of war, but war is much more present, and that fear is much stronger in the Balkans and other Central European countries. And they are calling upon NATO, the United States, and others to strengthen defenses, to strengthen Europe. And we see that the idea of Europe has been weakened by fear. And so we have to do a better job to protect ourselves. We see that Africa is under threat, that the idea of Europe, the European project, is under threat, that some alliances have fallen apart, others have come together. So we see now that India has banded and allied with Russia. Russia has gotten close, has banded with China. So is de facto, does that mean that India is is allying with China? We see that maybe the BRICS countries are also coming up and building a front against the Western world and democracy. So we see that all of this are a direct consequence of this war in Ukraine. And we can see that maybe one big war will hide another war, and which is the great rivalry between China and the United States. And all of that centers on the issue of Taiwan that could turn on a dime, and we could see a terrible downward spiral. So when we hear from Jean-Louis Bourlange, who couldn't be here with us today, unfortunately, because he has gone to Algeria with the president of France, but he did record a message that really mentions some of the tragic aspects that need analysis today. So in that context, we will divide our time in three parts. First, we will talk about the political effects of today's situation, so the breach between authoritarian systems and democracy, and ask the question if the liberal democracies have not come to the end of their road, because we see that our world, the world of disruptions, is maybe also disrupting our the 20th century political structures. In the second round table, we'll talk about growth and talk about if there is a future in big international partnerships, or now are we all focused instead on sovereignty and saving growth. So we'll have an economic, then a political, then economic debate. And then finally, we will talk about geopolitics and see how multilateralism could evolve so as to come up with solutions, maybe peaceful and balanced solutions. So those are our three parts of today's debate. Before, though, we've asked someone to share their analysis. So that is Rachel Kahn, who has done us a great favor. And to change, what we've decided to do is to give her the floor at the beginning of the meeting and then give it back to her at the end. So maybe she'll give us her thoughts, see if anything contradicted or was added, or if anything came up throughout today's debates. So we will do that, and we will also finish after her final remarks. We will finish with Andre Chan, who will meet with us for the 16th consecutive year. It has become quite a tradition. Thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you, Prefect, who represents our nation, our government. So thank you very much. Also, thank you to all of our elected representatives who honor us with their presence. And I would like to call Rachel up to the stage. She is an author, an artist, a writer, a legal expert, and even an athlete. She was French national champion of the triple jump. So welcome, Rachel Kahn.
Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre, très cher Jean-Pierre RAFFARIN, Monsieur le Président du Conseil départemental, Monsieur le Préfet, Monsieur le représentant des États,
Mr. Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I feel a certain international responsibility on. That's what Romain Gally said at one point. International responsibility is what is bringing us together today. And I'd like to thank the Foundation for Prospective Innovation and, of course, Jean-Pierre RAFFARIN and Mr. Gally. You have really, I'm very moved to be invited here. I want to thank you for having understood what I write, for having heard what I write, and for understanding. Was unplanned. But there was chaos in the world: slavery, the Shoah, shortages, immigration, disturbances in humanity. And after that chaos, there was, as usual, that attempted reparation. And I am the fruit of that reconstruction. I am the proof of different stories, different continents. And so, as a paradox, but also very logically, I'm here with you to talk about disturbances. My mother was a Jewish Polish woman who was hidden during the war. My father was from Senegal. His mother was Catholic. His father was Muslim. And so you can see that that history with a capital H is always part of our own personal history. But then what do we do with this mixed pedigree, which proves that reparation is possible? You can understand that I cannot turn my eyes away from the upcoming disturbances. The paradox of this is that in this interlinked world of economy and environment, we are witnessing an international disturbance, but also a national disturbance and even an intimate disturbance, as if our world were linked all of our worlds were linked. My situation is not just an individual advantage, that of being a sort of a mutant, because in Poland, where my mother grew up, the temperatures were -30, and in Senegal, where my father grew up, it was +40. I also carry the other aspects of my history through creation and action, which helps us to resist disturbances in our world. Creation is a major part of this, and yet very little understand. I'd like to quote Romain Gary, who was a writer and diplomat. In 1958, he wrote L'homme à la colombe while he was a diplomat at the United Nations. And it's important to understand what Gary had to say about the international organizations and their ability to react. This community, which was difficult to function collectively. I studied international law, but the others believed that international rights, international law was not applicable. That they believed that disturbances in the world force us to think together, and that's why I'm so glad to be with you today. Romain Gary was cynical about the United Nations, but throughout his writing, he supported Europe, Africa, Asia, and America. He had an even environmental look, and even when he talked about the United States in the 1960s, there were all of the hints of upcoming debates that are underway today. I often think of Romain Gary in his desire to construct something international, but while understanding our fragility and our fears. When you talk about disturbances, in fact, we're talking about questioning our links. How can we reconstruct those links? How can we mix those links in spirit? How can we remain open? Edouard Glissant talked about creolization, which is not just a question of mixed race. It's really about how to affront chaos through relations. And to affront those disruptions, we have to be in relation and not in confrontation. And the era of international relations should not be the era of disturbances. We have to look beyond the difficulties. We have to try to understand how to not erase the past, but to create links. How to we cannot write history with an eraser. We have to find common solutions through dialogue. So in today's context, so serious as it is, we have to remember that the Nazis said, "When I hear the word culture, I bring out my gun." And in today's world, given our background and our history, it's because we hear the guns that we have to support culture. The role of artists in our chaotic world is indispensable to keep the lights on. We hear signs about orchestration of a conference, an international agreement, action in concert. And remember that a hemicycle is always like an antique agora. We talk about actors on the international scene. And we are living through disturbances in the artistic wave. Afghan artists who can no longer paint and who live in pain rather than in color. Writers are threatened with death. Artists killed in Paris, concert halls where people are shot down. Influencers pretend to be artists addicted to followers and the number of likes. And with taking all of this into account, the artistic disturbance comes from self-censoring. Artists and comedians can no longer say what they think because they could be punished either in a courtroom or online. But artists, we must remember, are the legislators of the shadows. If we have no artists, our world will be dehumanized because it will be emptied of thought and emotion. It is the demands of beauty that bring us together. They are what bring us together in our humanity, and we need those connections. A world without artists is a world in complete disturbance. And to fight against those disturbances and to continue to live in the same world as our human brothers and sisters, free creation is the start of all possibilities, because racism and differentiation have no role to play. If we are here today, it's because we do not accept indifference to the world. We do not accept the idea of moving backwards and moving our civilizations backwards. So I do feel international responsibility, and that is why I'm here today with you. And I'm impatient to hear the roundtables that will take place with one single objective, that is that the world remain centered on its future. Thank you.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This idea that we can repair disruption through relations is essential. This brings us back to Edgar Morin, who also reminded us of the importance of relations and the art of dialogue and diplomacy. And particularly in the pandemic, when all the borders were closed and we did not choose dialogue and openness, the countries closed down and our relationships were sometimes very difficult to maintain. And we will be talking about how that complexity has had an influence on our situation. So thank you, Rachel Kahn, for giving us this cultural and spiritual launch for our mission today. I suggest now that we listen to Tertius ZONGO, who is a former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso and who was also Director of the World Bank. He's a very major African figure who will be talking to us through a video interview about the concerns of Africa and the disturbances, the effect of these disturbances in Africa. So we have recorded an interview with Mr. ZONGO, who is not able to be with us physically today. Mr. Prime Minister, good afternoon, dear Tertius. I'm so glad that you are able to be with us today at this 16th edition of the Geopolitical Forum at the Futuroscope. We're thinking together about the subject of Europe in a disrupted world. These disruptions are local, global, international, national. There are some very strong tensions growing, and we'd like to think about the perspective regarding the role of Africa. So thank you for being with us today with your very rich experience. Dear Jean-Pierre, thank you for organizing this forum, which enables several different actors to come together and discuss today's world and the disruptions that are ongoing. And as you said, they are economical, environmental, demographic, questions of violence in different regions. There are also technological disruptions, and I think that the main central point of these disruptions is that they increase rivalries, and they are creating a situation in which might makes right, and in our so-called civilized world, that might makes right. It brings up several issues. I'd like to start with the economic situation, and it's true that particularly for Africa, we can see that the COVID-19 crisis has had consequences. The war in Ukraine continues to have an effect on the well-being of our populations, and all of this has an influence on the African economy. The countries and the regions in Africa, I think, are already in a situation of fragility. But in addition to that, there are certain conflicts which mean that these countries are paying an even higher price for these disruptions. So the countries and the regions that are particularly fragile, as I said, are really in a very difficult situation to deal with the effects of climate change. So to be concise, when you look at the latest perspectives, the economic outlooks published by the World Bank, we see that the war in Ukraine will accentuate this slowdown, the slump in world economy, and particularly in the African economy. But what's really palpable is the sudden increase in the price of food and the price of fuel. And for our countries, which are particularly agricultural countries, the increase in the price of fertilizer are going to threaten our people. Up to 12 million people are threatened by hunger and food insecurity. So it's true that Africa is at a turning point right now in which this situation does bring up a certain number of problems. We have to think about the way in which we define our policies. Clearly, up until now, we've seen the role of our countries defining their policies, and the main role of a government is to define policies, but also to protect the environment so that we can increase security. But the real problem in Africa is, well, you know, the military said that terrain dictates maneuvers. And when you look at the terrain in Africa, and the terrain in Africa is a very informal terrain. That's the situation in Africa. When you look at most businesses, whether they be businesses in cities or in the countryside, they're small, very small businesses, family businesses that are part of the informal sector. So how can we help those small businesses in Africa who feed most of the African people? How can we help them? Those are the countries that create the most jobs, and how can we make sure that they play a primary role? I believe, Jean-Pierre, that when we look at what the major institutions have done to support governments and large companies, their support comes very often through loans which are not accessible to small businesses. So how can we help those small businesses free up their potential and be as resilient as possible in the face of this situation? I believe that these major questions that are being debated regarding additional funding should focus on the situation in Africa and the way in which the governments and their partners can find a mechanism to help fund the private sector and these small and medium-sized enterprises. This is important because we cannot ignore all of those businesses. We talk a lot about formalizing the informal sector, but how can you formalize that? How can we make sure that the informal sector moves forward? And the second point, how can we develop more public-private partnerships? This is very important. And it's important to redefine the confidence in the public-private partnerships. And food security is also going to be a major concern in upcoming years. If Africa wants to feed its population and give them correct health care, then we have to think about how to develop agriculture in a way that enables agriculture farmers to feed the population. So those are some of the main concerns for Africa. I think that the future is in the hands of the private sector, but we need new mechanisms, innovative mechanisms, and we need a certain increased awareness among the different players. We have to help the governments to support the private sector. Thank you, Tertius. Yes, this is a very important message for the private sector, because the public sector needs to reinvigorate him. From the point of view of Europe, we are very worried about terrorism, and we're worried about unemployment for young people, because we can see that in Africa, and not only in Africa, there are a lot of unemployed young people, and they are tempted to become involved with terrorism. And so we know that the question of economics and security and politics are linked. So what do you think of the situation with the young people and the increased terrorism and the outlook of better governance in Africa? I think that the first thing that we need to keep in mind is that when you think about the economy, actually is at the service of the government. We have to have a political approach which will bring economic objectives, and otherwise we will be heading for catastrophe. When we look at the situation in in the Sahel zone particularly, and in certain regions of Africa, what we see is that those countries, whether we want to admit it or not, the economic situation is difficult. The institutions are there, but we also have to recognize those countries are backed by the institutions. And in fact, when you look at the situation, the result is a mixed result. It's mixed because rather than integrating the majority of the population that tries to give their best, what we see are a certain number of fragilities that appear. That fragility comes from unemployment and from terrorism. And it's true that we cannot, it is true that poverty does play a role in terrorism, but it's not, we cannot say that when people are poor, they head towards terrorism. But there is a fundamental problem. How do we implement our policies? We're not talking about who is responsible. Clearly, the countries are responsible for their own policies and the way that they implement them. But when you look more closely at the inaction that we see, this is very important. If we do not act today, it means that we are accepting that people's hopes for a better life are disappearing, hope for democracy. And all of those hopes are interrupted. But the exportation of violence will continue in Europe and elsewhere. So we have to continue to act. And Jean-Pierre, I have 2 or 3 thoughts on that. First of all, we have to accept that up until now, then we have been looking in a very specialist, sectarian way, where we think that we know what we're talking about.
Develop as a whole. So what we need to do is we need to bring everyone around the table. Different actors from different sectors. Someone from the humanitarian sector doesn't think about the world the same as someone from security and safety. Someone from finance doesn't think the same as a diplomat. So for everything being done, what we see is that these different aspects, they come into play. So we need to move away from the sector-based approach, think together, think as a whole when we're thinking about development. That's my first point. So we need to see the fact that this shift, this break that is happening is also present in all political branches. So once we look all in the same direction and we set the same objectives and the same goals, we can move forward together. Because the problem we're currently facing is that we haven't always pulled together all actions being done so that these actions collectively can reach a single goal. And to do that, there's going to need to be a lot of change in how we do things, in partnerships. So for example, if you want to build a school, if you want to have quality education, well, to have quality education, you need to build a school, and in the school you need to have tables, you need to feed the children, because when they're hungry, well, then they can't actually participate in school. You need to give them drinking water on the school site, but that's just a few examples. You can't just say, no, I can build schools, but I can't actually pay the teachers' wages. Well, what's a school without teachers, well-paid teachers, or well-trained teachers? What result are you going to expect? So therefore, it's a question of procedure, of habits that are going to have to change. We're going to have to accept the fact that if we want to have a global approach, we need to look at the result that we want to achieve and put in everything that we can in place to achieve that goal. And third, when talking about public policy, We need to understand that no one really understands the reality on the ground better than those people who are actually living that. So all policy that is being implemented will, yes, they were devised and put together by experts who are specialists in a specific field, but sometimes they haven't actually gone and consulted those people who are going to benefit from that policy. So they have a sociological understanding, a political understanding, or an economic understanding of what's happening. But there is a shift or a break between their expertise and people on the ground. So therefore, we need to have national level experts working with local experts when coming up with public policy. They have to work together. And we need to have that because experiences around the world can be so very diverse and different. So we need everyone to be able to pitch in the drafting process of these public policies so that we can have this local knowledge with external, higher level expertise of a situation. And that way we can properly have development policies being well implemented. Because far too often people have been far too absent from the development policy drafting in determining what their needs actually are and how fragile they are. So oftentimes it's just been copy-paste of policies that have been taken from around the world. But what we need is a drafting and implementation process that pulls together all of these different aspects. So we need to have policies that feed into the needs of people, but people need to be part of the drafting process so that their needs can actually be heard. And local communities, they need to understand that everything they're doing in terms of public policy is to improve the well-being of the people in those communities. And we need to ensure that the local communities will be preserved and maintained for future generations. So yes, a lot has been done, but results are mixed and we cannot continue as we do. We have to choose things differently. Well, Tertius, thank you very much for that message about the fact that we need to break down the sector-based approach, that we need to have a more horizontal, cross-cutting approach as opposed to a vertical approach. So one final point on geopolitical tensions when here we're talking about China. So China just last week put forward a bolstered partnership and alliance between Africa and China. And we can see that the Chinese have certain objectives in Africa, considerable goals that they want to achieve there. But we can also see that France, but also the rest of Europe, is struggling in Africa when we look at the Americans competing against the Chinese as well. So Africa, is it being subject to external pressure, or is it carrying its own, or is it hostage of its own situation, of the international situation? What is your take on this? Well, I think it's very much a current affairs type issue. I think we could just make an observation when we look at relationships between Africa and the Western world. What we can see is that China has been virtually inexistent from those relations. And when we look at history, Africa has tended to be on the side of history of the Western world. And that's an observation that we can make looking back at history, but now we need to take stock of that situation. And we need to look at the state of the relationship between state-level cooperation between Africa and the Western world. And there are a few lessons we can learn from this. What we can see is that China has understood exactly where the weaknesses lie in that current status quo. So China is being very pragmatic because they are working on cooperation. But if we want to see more cooperation, we need to come back to reality on the ground. And that's what China has understood, because they're being very pragmatic about the way they intervene, the way they cooperate. And their pragmatism focuses on it's as if we are in their grasp, but it's a gentle grasp, the way they see it. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, I think we need to look at the way cooperation has taken foot in the continent over the past. And no one is going to ban a partner from working with a beneficiary as long as they are fully aware of the current political situation in the country. And they're not going to come and say, this is how we're going to deal with your economic situation in your country. They aren't in charge of policy. Policy and political sphere, that's what governs economic interests. And when we look at political problems, and when we try and focus on that, that has never been something that has been discussed openly. It's always been economic issues that are being discussed openly, but not political issues. Is a democratic model, is that the way forward in Africa? Is it appropriate? Is it bringing the results that people are looking for? Well, that isn't, unfortunately, the question that has been asked. China is going down this way of non-interference in internal affairs, in domestic policy. China, they are moving ahead with their own installations, their own sites. But when you look at that, and when you look at the Chinese cooperation, and then you compare that to the past of our cooperation with the Western world, we can see that so much of African resources have been exported. But when you look at how much is being invested in infrastructure, all types of infrastructure, we can see that the results, they're not mixed results, they're catastrophic results. When you look at, for example, the different ports, the seaports in Africa for transport, the largest investment is coming from China. So Africa, how is Africa going to have weight in the world if it can't have access to the world? If it can't be competitive when trying to deliver to the world what it has in its own lands? So I think we need to be very clear on this point. In my point of view, and maybe my point of view is shared by some in the room, I remember Jean-Pierre, one time when we met, there was a proverb that you shared with me. They said, what role does a goat have to play in a fierce combat between tigers and lions? And Africa is in the middle of that fight that you were speaking of. But is Africa the goat? And are we watching tigers and lions fighting? So what are we meant to do if we are the goat in that metaphor? And what opportunity do we have? Well, that's what we are seeing now, because we have opportunity in Africa where we can use what we have in our country, in our continent. And now we can see how we can weigh in on the global stage. And Europe is that bridge through which Africa can find balance and a position in the world. Because Africa has a long-standing history of cooperation with Europe. Europe knows Africa inside out. We have to find ways of leveraging that so that Europe can come back into a new way of looking at economics in Africa and being part of the Africa-China economic equation. We need to find the keys to understanding that. And I think there are two ways in which we can understand that. First, Europe needs to move on from this feeling of guilt from colonization. The colonial period is behind us now. And when Europeans come to Africa, they need to no longer come to Africa as if they were coming into a once colonized country. They need to come into a country where they know the people, they know what it's like in the ground, a country they're familiar with. And that is the best way they can be a true partner of Africa. That is the first key, is moving away from this colonized Africa mindset that some Europeans have. The second is that we need to understand that France and Great Britain, they are the two countries that have a fundamental role to play in setting up this new form of cooperation between Africa and this cooperation that Africa is now also having with Asia. So I don't want to go into the fine details of how we can look at that and how the local populations see that cooperation between Africa and China. But I'm just saying this is a way forward. We need to see a bridge being built so that we can have economic cooperation with China, with Africa. And Europe is the key to that. And Europe needs to play its fundamental part. And I think it's possible. Tertius, thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. It's always fantastic to listen to you. And it's always very insightful when we get to listen to African wisdom. And I think that it is fundamental what you've been able to bring to this table, and it is with great friendship that I thank you. Jean-Pierre, thank you very much.
J'ai bien conscience qu'une vidéo, c'est toujours un peu long.
Well, I understand that videos are always quite long and maybe a bit tiresome to watch, but there was a lot in what he said, and he really touched on some topics which are very important to today's conversation. There were two key messages that came out of that for me. First, the breaking down of specialization when looking at foreign aid. One way of creating links and for building schools is the example he gave us, is that you need a school, but you need teachers. And you can't just do one without the other. So that's why we need to have this cross-cutting approach, a horizontal approach, so that you have someone who is, everyone sitting around the table, someone dealing with teacher pay, someone dealing with water, someone dealing with food, someone dealing with actually building the school. And it's when you can have all of these people working together that you can ensure well-being for local people. And the second message he gave us, given that the French president is currently in Algeria right now, is that we need to move on from colonial guilt. It's very important that we need to have a very clear mind on what happened in the past, but we also need to look to the future now. So we're going to continue this politically charged debate with our first roundtable discussion, and I would like to invite to the stage Jean-Marie Keyno, who's former French diplomat, attaché to UN, professor at Columbia University, and author of a book that I highly recommend to all of you, The First 21st Century. And this is the first 20 years of this 21st century. And it is analysis of the world that we're trying to understand as part of this roundtable discussion. So I'd like to invite him up to the stage, also to the stage of Fabienne Keller, a member of the European Parliament based in Strasbourg, who's quite heavily involved in a lot of international matters. So if Fabienne Keller, you would like to join us on the stage here? I will now hand over to Jean-Marie Keyno. If you could just give us an overview of the current international situation, your take on it, and maybe to ask the question, are democracies going to survive in the modern world when authoritarian regimes are on the rise? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, Your Excellency. You have the floor. Prime Minister, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, representatives, elected officials. It is a great joy for me today to be able to speak before you all here at Futuroscope. Because while we can be somewhat outraged by the fundamental transitions that are taking place, it's also with a sense of wonder that we look on what is happening. And here at the Futuroscope, this is a space that invites us, encourages us to think about the future. So maybe we can turn that horror into more amazement and more wonder. As a diplomat myself, I feel that modern-day diplomats are a little lost. They are lost simply because the world as we know it is no longer just a mix of states communicating with each other using diplomatic channels. Diplomats, nowadays, they no longer have the monopoly over international discourse. It is a much more porous world with more networks. It's a very fluid world, where domestic and foreign policy interact constantly, where the steadfast nature of an internal policy depends heavily on what is happening around the world. And therefore, we see that there are more and more countries responding to the outside world simply because they're coming under attack from all sides. So this first roundtable discussion is going to be on political ruptures and the end of the liberal cycle. The current world, as I said, is very fluid. It's almost like a world of multiple layers that interact and intermerge with each other. And when we look at the strings at play, tying all of the parts of this puzzle together, this is what I'm going to try and look at right now in as simple a way as possible. Again, because I don't want to be oversimplistic, even though I am going to try and simplify it. When facing the crises that our democracies are now facing, there is a fundamental question that comes forward, and that is the issue of the economy.
So we have a middle class that is seeing an increase in inequality, and we see that the differences between social classes is widening. I'm not an economist, I can't give an economic explanation, but I don't think the reasons are only economic in nature, because otherwise how can you explain that these quote-unquote populist issues touch countries like the United States, Italy, France, and others, countries that that used to be pretty equal, that are seeing their inequalities widening. So in this complicated world, I am going to make 5 points. Number 1 is that to understand the depth of today's crisis, we need to go back to 1989, which was a wonderful year, a magical year. We had the impression that it was a new world, and maybe the sense of triumph was a bit premature, and led instead to the falling apart of a system that came to the end of its road. Remember that Francis Fukuyama called that era the end of history. And this had several negative consequences. Number 1 is that it fed a sense of hyper-individualistic individuality. We saw the rise of the individual and a weakening of thinking about the collective. Yes, individuals are important in society, but if we're talking about individuals and individuality, an all-powerful individuality, well, then I don't agree. We also need to look inwards, to be critical of ourselves. We thought that Russia and the former Soviet republics were going to hitch themselves to our democratic wagon. And yes, we've lost an enemy. We lost an enemy, but what did we have in common? Well, in Europe, we took giant steps forward, such as the creation of the common currency, the euro. But I think that we continued to view Europe as an entity, as a place where we wanted to prevent war between our nations. But that's not exactly the question that came out after 1989. And actually, maybe the issue was more Europe's relationship with the rest of the world, as Mr. Raffarin and our previous speaker mentioned. So, and with time, we've seen that that is more and more true. We see that with the tragedy in Ukraine. We may not have thought enough about a system that could guarantee safety in a post-Soviet system back then. And so we maybe are paying the price for some of our mistakes, the mistakes that were committed 30 years ago. So the individuals who were promised omnipotence are finding that there are limits to that power, and we see that a lot of people are disheartened with the politics, skeptical towards the ability of our elected officials to manage current issues. And we also see that they not only do individuals doubt our capacity, but also I myself, who worked at the UN for more than 10 years, I see that diversity of people in our world is a richness, but a lot of people who didn't have the same background, the same career that I did, might not see things the same way and might be threatened by immigration and diversity. Not everybody sees eye to eye, and we're not really ready to deal with it. I see in the United States how a very diverse society, the United States tries to answer that by contracting relationships between people, but it makes life unlivable in some ways. It's very difficult to reconcile diversity and individuality. I know we're on the path to finding a solution, but we really haven't found workable solutions yet. I also see that lots of extremists are making claims that aren't really concrete solutions or proposals, but try to, for instance, with the wall between Mexico and the United States, it's not really a policy, but it's a symbol that a lot of people cling to. And so also we see a lot of people believing in certain myths that make dialogue and discussion difficult. So those are the two issues. The third is the exponential power of the internet and new technologies. And there we see a widening breach between political institutions and the world, the economic and technological world. And I can see firsthand in the United States the huge power of the United States and the remarkable technological advancements that happen there. But we see that the current revolution, technological revolution that we're going through, go beyond the technological advancements of the printing press, but it combines what was so special about the revolution of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution. And so we also see that the technological world says that AI is the requirement. And I see that we're seeing the same kind of revolution and upheaval that we had with the advent of the printing press. And so also we see a lot of virtual communities that are to competition for actual local communities. And these virtual communities that look inward and are becoming increasingly polarized. And so we see that societies are kind of atomizing because these communities give the appearance of being autonomous, and they, liking something is a way of expressing your opinion in a directly democratic way. But it's a sort of false direct democracy. At the same time, and this is the other side of the coin, is that we're seeing an enormous concentration of power in the businesses in the Western world and in nations and in countries like China that use data collection to their advantage. So in democracies, we see there's a risk of ultra-polarized and dysfunctional societies, societies in which no one talks directly, everybody insults each other on Twitter. And we see also public debate is being managed by big media conglomerates. The other risk, on the other hand, is that we see a consolidation of data that would be used to a sort of preventative dictatorship. And we see this in China, and it's just the advent of this type of society, but using all of the data that is collected about you against you. And these twin risks will lead to either scattered violence or mass violence of nationalistic groups using social media to kind of create a people. I don't want to end on such a dark note, because I am in awe or in wonder of some things in our worlds, because I think that in this possible dystopia, there are some bright spots, because we are undergoing profound upheaval, but I think that rebuilding social capital is essential, and it can only come from the bottom up. And when we come here and we see what something like the Futuroscope can do for a region, it can create social ties, and it plays a key role in rebuilding the social fabric that has ripped. And we need to go from local to global, from the actual local community to the virtual community, and create bridges between people. Ms. Keller is going to talk about the European Parliament later, which is an institution that should allow us to go from local to global. We talked about this at breakfast this morning. These institutions that are helping us go towards the global, but maybe also to help us we need to do a better job for local communities to understand the role of these institutions. And also, people have to understand the legitimacy of different ways of thinking. So, for instance, the COVID gave a voice or a light to the scientific community. The scientific community can talk about risks, but it is not up to the scientific community to talk about how much risk people are willing to take, and that's up to the political community and politicians. And I think also this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are distrustful of this system. Also, finally, we need to rethink universalism without falling into relativism. I am in favor of pluralism, but I think we need to coordinate different value systems and recognize the fact that there is a diversity of thinking linked to different pasts, different backgrounds. I'm not going to go on into that too much, but there are also different ways of working. I believe in the words of Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher. I talked about the juxtaposition between the collective and the individual, and maybe we have to come up with a different balance between the two. We see that in Asia, the collective good is much more important than individuality, and I think in our society we've gone too far in valuing the individual. But we have to recognize that different societies have worth and have value for thinking of things in a different way, and I saw this, it was very important in my work at the United Nations. We need to go towards a world and accept that the balance between different value systems can vary from one part of the world to another without completely denying and rejecting our own values. Thank you very much. Please take a seat here. Thank you for sharing your complex and worrisome vision as well. The fact that we're seeing that individualism today can lead to indifference, selfishness, and a lot of nations have been rendered more fragile by this way of thinking. And now we're going to watch a video, which is a very pessimistic video, but that has, and it's a message from Jean-Louis Bourlange, who is president of the Committee for International Affairs in the French Parliament. He couldn't be here today because he's in Algeria, but I wanted you to see his very powerful and deep thoughts, because it's going to give us a lot of food for thought and a lot of things to talk about. But there is hope. Ms. Keller will give us her Alsatian point of view, and I think that there is a lot to be hopeful for in the end. But now I'm going to pass the floor to Jean-Louis Bourlange. I am Jean-Louis Bourlange. I would have liked to have been there with you today, but unfortunately, the president of France asked me to accompany him, and obviously I could not refuse such a wonderful invitation. So I would like to thank the organizers of this very interesting seminar and thank them for allowing me to speak to you through this recording. So the idea is, if the liberal system has just been put on pause or is going to end. And that's hard to answer that question. It depends on three things that I'm not sure are realistic. Number one, it supposes a sort of constancy in the way we organize our collective lives. If there any kind of cycle has a sort of waxing and waning, or a circle between liberalism, exchange, markets, democracy, and then periods of that are more authoritarian, closed off, hostile to free markets, and that also leads to a more conflictual way of working. I'm not sure we've gotten to that point, though. And I think that the issues that we're facing today are the same ones as before, but we are seeing a tremendous upheaval in the political system and a true usurping of our political system. And the second thing, I'll talk about that more in a second, but the second thing I'd like to talk about is that since we're talking about cycles, this means that you have to look at things in a sort of fatalistic way, because things rise and things fall. In the past, it was a time of free market. That time is over. We just have to wait and it will come back. So that's a sort of Aristotelian way of looking things. But it leaves little room for free will. And then again, I'm not quite sure that it is a sort of such a black and white, two-sided way. I think, no, we're going through a profound change that, and it means that in 10 or 20 years, we will find ourselves in a profoundly different system than we were in 20 years ago. And the third point is that things are happening now. So, this period of since Emmanuel Macron was elected to his first term, we've seen some changes. And there again, I don't quite agree with that time frame, because we've seen changes. These changes have been afoot since the end of the Cold War. What we used to call the liberal social European project has been on hold in a way, or European. A lot of people started to doubt the European project even before the euro came about. And a lot of the great centrist parties in France in the past and Europe of the past, in a lot of countries except Germany, started to question it from the middle of the 1990s. And the class of civilizations, we saw that with September 11th. We saw that with the migrant crisis. We saw the economic and monetary imbalance more than 10 years ago. So this is not, we don't find ourselves at the end of a cycle, but rather in the middle of a deep time of transformation worldwide.
And I think we have to think about the nature of that change. We have to look at things in depth. We are faced with a true shift in our humanist foundations of our political anthropology. I believe that we're confronted with 5 very concerning evolutions. First of all, humans have ceased being the subject of history, has become the object of history, whether it be materialist or through Marxism or humanism through Christianism, gave the human dimension to a country, but something about a lost paradise or a future paradise, or a mix between the two, with a phase of the fall and then redemption. And this has to do with the prophecies in the different thought processes. And that time is over. And we're just trying to find our way through this present tense, which is a sort of a gap between the past and the future. Second main change is that human beings are now in the center of nature, in the middle of nature and not at the center. And this is again a change in the Marxist Cartesian thought processes. We are now in a situation where people are lost. There's veganism, the position of the animals in the world, the position of nature. Who are we? Where are we? Dechristianization of our society. The status of human beings is related to the soul, and we don't know where the soul is anymore. So we are now destroying our own position, and we're losing meaning, we're losing our reference points in this universe, which is, and this is very concerning. Thirdly, people are no longer the Lord. Men are no longer the lords of the human species. We have men and women, and this is a shift after 10,000 years at least, in which women were dominated by men. And this is something that is much more, even more disruptive than, for example, the emancipation of the working class, which occurred a couple of centuries ago with the Industrial Revolution. Now we're talking about an inequality that was never justified and has now been questioned. And what's questioned is not only the equality between men and women, but also the specialization of the roles of women, so the sexuation itself, sexuation of collective life. Gender has disappeared from family roles and has come up in political parties, for example. This is a very great disruption, and we're only at the very beginning of that. The fourth element is that human beings have become plural. This is very important. They are plural because we're no longer talking about a single humanity, but several humanities. This is something that we heard through Foucault and Strauss and structuralism of fundamental humanism, because that humanist revolution, which dates back to the 1950s and 60s, means that people are no longer the subject of history. It's the structure that creates human beings and not humans who create the structure. Our model is no longer universal. It is contested. It is detested. It is confronted by other models, religious totalitarian, material totalitarianism, and many other threats that are out there, challenges, and our moral superiority is no longer confirmed. We are, and fifth and finally, we are in the process of a cognitive revolution, which means that we are replacing the work of the thought process through reason, and priorities are being replaced by programmed actions. And what's replacing our thought process are immediate gratification, instant action, and this leads to a breakdown in social links. Of course, we have there was a book about the cyber revolution that discusses this particularly well. And so how should we react to all of this? Of course, we could say we are Europe, we have our values, we are humanists. We want to organize our values. We want to unify our policies and organize ourselves. That would be relatively justifiable, but it is risky. Partly because Europe has a past history and does not play the role currently that it would like. Also because our model is a model of openness. and because our model is being confronted by dissolution trends. And so when we look at that, we look at this sense, the meaning of the humanist combat that we should be leading. If I were a diplomat, I would say I am preoccupied. And if I were Léon Blum, I would say I am fearful. Yes, for me, the future is a question, is a subject of concern or even fear, and that's not a very optimistic message, but that's what I have to share with you today. Thank you. So you see why geopolitics and philosophy can come together, and there are convergences with what we heard earlier when Mr. Guénaud was speaking. And now I would like us to listen to Fabienne Keller, who is a representative of the European Parliament and represents this new dynamics. And in regards to the questions that have been brought up, what is the perspective, the outlook of the European Parliament? Is the European Parliament actually a democratic force in Europe? And if so, is that force being used for a very profoundly European strategy, or is it as complex as the current world? Is it a place for dialogue? And is it a place for dialogue with authoritarian regimes, or is it a place for confrontation? What is the destiny of the European message? Is it really to be at the head of the European culture, or is it a sort of a bridge between different civilizations in order that so that they can live together, taking into account our differences between individuals and collective societies, and is the European Parliament a bridge? Germaine, Fabienne, what do you think? Thank you, dear Jean-Pierre, and thank you for this very difficult question. Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Representative of the European Parliament, I'd like to thank you for having invited me today, and I'm here to share my experience at the European Parliament. I grew up in Alsace and in Strasbourg, so I was born with Europe, and also I also was there where the war and the conflict took place. We have a concentration camp in Asia, in Alsace, because we were in Nazi country, and it's just unimaginable to think that human beings do that. And so Alsatians looked forward rather than looking backwards. Churchill came to Strasbourg and made a speech in 1947, just a couple of years after the armistice. And the university began teaching again immediately in 1945. And in 1949, even though the food was still rationed and people were still living in temporary housing, the European Parliament sent delegations to start building the European Parliament. So that's what Europe is all about, and that's what Alsace is all about. But we now have to reinvent the project, rebuild that project. But I believe that the project is still as strong as ever. In any way, I'd like to share with you the interest of being in Babel's Tower in the Parliament of Europe. close and far at the same time. We have this we're lucky to have interpretation, so we understand each other. We all speak our own languages and we understand each other, but we are interested in each other. So what is the future of our liberal project? Let me present that to you. First of all, Europe respects each member state's political entity, and then there are differing opinions which are part of our disrupted world, but the institution and the governance are agile and resilient, as we were able to see in recent episodes. The European Parliament is a representation of the different nations, and the different nations are illiberal democracies in some cases. For example, in Hungary, where Mr. Orbán was re-elected last March, the free press no longer exists in Hungary. The justice system is under control of the government. The organized systems, the separation of powers no longer exists in Hungary. And this is in the Didier Reiner's annual report describes this very objectively. And certain values which are central to the European Union are no longer respected. And the EU demanded that certain values be respected when a member state becomes a member, but once that member state is a member and those values are no longer respected, it's much more difficult for the EU to know how to react. And so, and this causes difficulties in funding. The situation in Poland is also cause for concern because the press is also being controlled. You know that a certain number of judges in Poland have been suspended, and gradually the counter powers are leaning towards the current administration. There's also the war in Ukraine. Poland is taking in many refugees, which has given a new form of legitimacy to the government, and the Polish Prime Minister wrote an editorial in Le Monde to underline the importance of unanimous positions from the EU, and taking it as an example the war in Ukraine as a reason to come up with acceptable responses. There's also a future situation, very probable in Italy. There will be where Madame Meloni will probably be the future prime minister at the head of an extreme right-wing coalition. So that is the European reality. There are elections continuously in different countries. We have 27 members, and so things are continuously changing within our member states. For example, in the election in Sweden recently. So Europe evolves with the institutions of the at the national level. Now, my second point, the challenges that Europe is faced with. There's of course the migratory crisis, which was very real in 2016, but I'd also like to underline that European immigration is very much under control. Our boundaries are controlled by the Schengen space. We have a border control system. Of course, it can be improved, but it is much under control. But welcoming the Ukrainians in Europe has shown how European citizens can be welcoming. So that's one challenge. Second challenge, the culture shock within Europe. I was so happy to hear Rachel Kahn earlier, who turned this around and talked about, on the contrary, the richness of Europe. One of the richnesses of Europe is that we respect each other, and we know that we have different European cultures, and we know that Europe is made up of its cities, and we know that we're in Europe both when we're home and when we're elsewhere. There's this this multiple aspect of the European culture. And Europe is also a place where intelligence and curiosity lead us to be interested in our neighbors. And that's where we have to cultivate that curiosity through various processes. For example, Erasmus exchanges, which are available to anyone in the student population. And I'd like to share my experience. As an elected representative, I go out and I talk to my constituencies, and it's interesting to see how, I also can talk about my colleagues. I went with Rosa Thun, the Polish colleague. We went to the Belarusian border where there were walls going up, and I also went to Moldavia and Ukraine with a young colleague who created a network with 3,000 people involved and willing to welcome Ukrainian refugees. We also went to Western Ukraine. We were able to talk with people in Ukraine and in Romania, and where we were aware of the solidarity between people. We also met with Pietro Bartolo, who is a fisherman and a doctor, and has been working with migrants, and who is such a human richness, so much experience. And of course, we can only create legislation if we take the time to understand the people, our colleagues, and those realities.
The third challenge is the issue of population concern. We see that many European countries have a dropping birth rate. We see that young trained professionals are moving to other countries where there is much more prosperity to be found. And this is what I see when I meet with a lot of my Romanian counterparts, is they're asking me, how can we bring our country back onto its own 2 feet when they don't have the right entrepreneurs staying in the country, when they don't have elected officials who are well trained to roll out all of the policy, that the European level policy that is being brought in. There is a divide between the elite and the people, between the upper echelons of society and the rest of the population. How can the European wealth be properly shared between all Europeans? There is also a trade issue when each member state has its own vested interests, its own trade interests. Europe has values, and it holds on to those values quite strongly. And it upholds a certain number of values that it will not waver on, especially when it comes to forced labor and dealing with foreign trade partners. But also what we have seen is that we have partners to the east. Something that really came to the fore as part of the Ukraine crisis is that financial aid can come from the European Union, and financial aid can be so useful, as we've seen with Ukraine. But in addition to that, we can do so much more in addition to the Council of Europe in ensuring relationships between countries, between our neighboring countries. And that is the project that we have in coming up with a European political partnership. And also when it comes to defense partnership, this is something that also came to the fore in light of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The European Union was able to agree upon a roadmap at the beginning of March that showed long-standing political will coming from France, and it was bolstered by what is happening in Ukraine, but also the balance that needs to be struck between the European Union and NATO. Is Europe and the EU going to be part of NATO, or is it going to be a way of federating and rallying more countries together? When we see that member states taking on very different standpoints, obviously reflecting their own past, their own concerns, and their own future. And also Sweden and Finland are two major issues, part of that, Poland as well, not to forget the Baltic states. So Europe is faced with a number of challenges, and they're the ones I just touched upon, and we are speaking today of a world in disruption. And I would like to talk about a number of breaking points, and we could talk about the United States here. Now, I also have some experience back in Berkeley, and I am quite close to the American people. So the Supreme Court recent decisions when it comes to abortion, the right to bear arms, but also when it comes to the environment, the upcoming midterms in the United States, that will weaken President Biden's ability and power to act. This is creating severe breaking points, divisiveness within the United States. Now, while there is much to be dismayed about, there are a few shining beacons of hope, like what we have seen in Kansas, in terms of right to abortion. But despite the general difficulties that Americans are facing nowadays, they are still a democracy, and we in Europe, we are the other major democratic power in the world. Now, we have democracies that operate differently, but we have those two levels of governance in both our countries, and we have to continue to converse with them and respect them and respect their decisions. The other breaking point that we're seeing in the world, well, we have seen the Islamic revolutions around the world, the rise of the Taliban, and we were left speechless in seeing pictures of Afghan women. And I remember going out there with the international forces sent out by the UN, and there was some hope that society was going, in the country was going to open up, that women were going to be able to access culture, education, to be somewhat freer. But that hope was completely shattered in recent times. So that itself is a great change that we are seeing. We can also see what is happening in Turkey. Turkey is also doing very poorly now. It's a member of NATO. But when we look at its position, it is very complex, especially when talking about its relationship to crisis in Ukraine and the Turkish Straits. And Turkey is following a number of EU sanctions, but not others. And we can also see its involvement in Syria. So what I would like to touch upon is that while Europe is ever-changing, it is constantly moving, while there are constant major challenges, and while it may be in a time of great breaking points, there are a number of fundamentals. A strong legal building blocks, all of its fundamental charters, the treaties that make Europe. But while we are here talking today about whether we're moving away from a liberal world, while the liberal world is changing, it is not yet entirely gone. It has been weakened, but it is still there. And oftentimes at the European Parliament, we talk about many topics, the balance of power, and the balance of power that we need to maintain to ensure that balance, but also the notion of governance. We have the Council of Heads of Government, we also have the Ministerial Councils, we have the Parliament, the European Parliament. And as was shown during COVID crisis, the European Parliament is able to make strong decisions. We have its institutions that are actually quite effective in times of crisis, where we roll up our sleeves and we act. And because we know how to work, because we respect each other, we listen to each other, and that is what helps us come up with solutions. So, Jean-Pierre, that is what I would like to say, is that Europe is something that we can change. And I'm part of the Renew group, the political center. I was a part of UDF in the past, but we are there to say that we aren't there to criticize Europe. We need to change Europe. We have a system that's in place. It's there and it's built on democracy. Yes, democracy can sometimes be quite slow, but it's powerful. And through democracy, we consolidate so much from within our countries, and united, we are stronger when facing global challenges. Thank you. Fabien, thank you very much. Please take your seat once again. I would just like to say that the message you gave us there is something that I felt very strongly when Xi Jinping came 2 years ago to Paris. Obviously, pre-COVID, when everyone could travel, he was received in Paris by President Macron as part of a bilateral meeting, and in attendance was both Jean-Claude Juncker and Angela Merkel. And that is a perfect example of how Europe is open to conversation and discussion with China. And that is something where oftentimes we may feel that Europe is all-powerful, but it is losing that power. But when we see Asia, there are still countries that haven't overcome from the fallout of the Second World War. China and Japan are just 2 examples, and they're moving on, and they are starting to move forward. But Europe is born out of the Second World War, and when we see the way the French and the Germans now work together, we have traveled so far, we have come so far, and we need to remind ourselves constantly that Europe came from a major upheaval in Europe, a global event. And because of that, we are now on solid footing. We have solid bedrock. I'd like to now turn to our panelists. So, turn to you first, Jean-Marie Guéhenno. So you're living now in the United States, teaching at Columbia University, teaching diplomatic policy. Tell us about Europe and the United States. So we often speak of the war in Ukraine, saying that Russia is not going to win, that Ukraine is not going to win, Europe is not going to win, that there are going to be no winners. So, but the people who sell weapons, gas, and oil, they're the winners, and that's the United States. Now, is that the case? Do you feel that it is? Or deep down, because we are caught between our political alliance on one side, we are allies with the United States, and we have the Chinese market on the other side, and the trade tensions between the United States and China. Is it not that deep down, this American egocentricity is not going to undermine European strategy? And what about the political debate of the future? Or maybe Trump is going to be back in power, or someone of his kind. So we have the West which used to be the democratic powers, while some countries are moving away from democracy. Is this Western alliance, is it something that nowadays is relevant as it once was in the past? Well, I think most Europeans, as you said yourself, they believe in the alliance with the United States. And the United States under the Biden administration, which is a more traditional type of administration in the United States, it is a bond that is quite a strong bond between our two continents. But when we look at the long-term past of Europe and the United States, we can see that the United States is predominantly concerned about China. The Americans would not bear seeing a major global power overtake them. And they are deeply concerned. They are deeply concerned by Chinese growth. And for them, Russia is a problem of the past. Russia, it's important nowadays because it has a lot of nuclear weapons. They can be quite annoying at times, but it doesn't have the same economic weight in terms of energy. Will their hydrocarbons, will their oil still bring the same geopolitical weight in the next 20 years or 30 years. In terms of population demographic concern, this is something that we heard about just a little earlier. This is a major concern in Russia, not just in Europe. So, yes, Russia needs to be contained, but it's not the priority. That's the American point of view. And for a lot of Americans, they see Europe as being very wealthy, and they say, well, maybe Europe can take on some of the burden. Why are we competing against Europe for a number of issues in terms of economy? Airbus, Boeing is just one example, but there are many others we could quote. So why are we subsidizing Europe, Europe that can defend itself? So given that context, and you've got Trump, but there are many others like him, a large portion of the Republican Party, they believe in America first. America needs to lead. But they also believe that it's not up to America to ensure world or European security. NATO is a way of controlling or providing some sort of control for Europeans, but Americans don't believe that they need to be doing as much as they currently are for European security, and I believe that's something that's going to continue in the future. And if Trump comes back to power, and it's highly plausible, and we would be highly remiss if we were to ignore that eventuality, Europe will have to be bigger, more powerful to say, Europe, you need to take charge of your own affairs. And that's what we're likely going to see in the future. Now, if France says, let's try and create something similar or against NATO, well, that will be dropped by a lot of European countries. But if they try and create a European pillar, a larger pillar built in Europe, so that if any of the other pillars were to disappear, then at least the European pillar would be there to support and bear the brunt of the charge, then that would be possible. And then when we look back at America, well, America is then going to be nervous because they're going to see Europe flying on their own wings, and they'll be on their own. So it's a contradiction when America, they want us to be more independent, but they also want to keep some form of control over us. Interesting comments. So yes, Europe is going to be caught between, caught on tenterhooks, because you have to, on one side, create a midterm and long-term European defense systems, both parallel but also tied in with NATO. And then you have NATO in the mix that you were just talking about. That is also on the other side. Fabienne, if we turn back to what Jean-Marie Guéhenno was speaking of a little earlier, he was speaking of global powers. But now it needs to be more an issue of markets. But markets create bonds, but they're internal bonds. It's not necessarily a notion of power. When we see competition-based policy rolling out, it's very different because you've got multinationals that necessarily aren't acting in the notion of creating a fair society. But talking about the European Union, can it not be the avant-garde? Can it not lead the charge when speaking about this notion of powers, superpowers? Could it not be a political platform for democracy, but one that interests itself in more than just internal or domestic policy? Because when talking about Hungary, for example, we always get the feeling that Europe is willing to, and very much excited about talking about everything happening domestically within European borders, but not necessarily thinking bigger picture globally. And maybe I have this wrong here, but we get the feeling that the European Parliament doesn't necessarily focus on its relationship with Africa and on a number of major topics. So in light of the fact that we have very highly experienced people in governance and international politics, speaking of it like this, would it not be interesting for Europe to really lead the charge in terms of democracy, in terms of that new future? pulling together European nations and acting almost like a negotiation ground where other nations come to Europe and utilize us as a negotiation table so we can be the middleman. What are your thoughts on that? Interesting idea, but to give you a very technical response. When talking about the European budget, there are a number of rules, voting rules that we have to apply. Very simple. The Parliament has to decide together with the Council of Ministers and heads of state and government. The Parliament has oversight and has a certain weight when it comes to decisions being made domestically. And when it comes to diplomacy, we have the External Affairs under Joseph Borrell and 27 diplomatic forces. Not all of them obviously have the same weight. And sometimes they have also commission support for that, commission competency. So I am in charge of immigration affairs. And we unfortunately don't actually have open dialogue with origin countries, a number of African countries that you spoke of a little earlier, for which we have very normal channels of dialogue that are already open, but we don't have these open conversations on that, so that we can meet with the governments from Senegal, Morocco, and the like, and that we can talk with them. Now, there are two forms of immigration. There's obviously illegal immigration, but there's also other forms of economic immigration. But we need to have open dialogue with these countries that we can show that we can authorize a certain level of migration. Now, again, while yes, we can provide them with training, we're not trying to steal their talented, qualified younger generations. But unfortunately, we have young people who are putting themselves and putting their fates in the hands of very unscrupulous people trying to cross the Mediterranean, just hopefully that one day they will actually have proper papers. So Europe, we need to put the means on our side to welcome in these people properly. And we have a lot of people coming in through Tunisia, through Lampedusa. France, I think we have probably the second largest embassy after Washington here, and we have a lot of relationships with Africa. We have mutual understanding, and yet it's still not a topic that is discussed. It's just not discussed. And it can't be discussed on its own. It needs to be a conversation that happens because it's a humanitarian crisis. When we look at what's been happening with all of the smugglers, it is something that we shouldn't let happen, quite simply. But that conversation needs to happen, and the situation can only be resolved when we have proper diplomatic conversations, maybe through the Parliament, but also working with other European institutions. And similar well, it's the same for defense. Unfortunately, we're not yet there when it comes to diplomatic conversations. So take Tunisia, for example. Take two other states, Italy, France. They're quite often partners. They could lead the charge and speak on behalf of all of the others, obviously in constant conversation with them, with the External Affairs Office. And maybe for South America, Spain could lead the charge. But we need to have that European diplomacy when it comes to development, co-development, respect of mutual respect.
So, if we want to find a way out of the darkness, so to speak, for Europe, so we have a lot of experience with this democratic experience or adventure, if you will. But there's something that we don't talk about enough. With the Paris Agreement, we achieved consensus around what we called the globalization of consciousness, as we call it here at the Foundation. We see a lot of youth and a lot of young people who know that we have to protect the planet if we want to protect our future, which is a relatively new concept for geopolitics. But young people in Singapore, San Francisco, Seattle, Sweden, Liechtenstein have all understood this. So what I'm getting at is, do you think that we shouldn't take on these issues of the future rather than rehashing this old idea, old concept of democracy over and over again. Yes, Europe is right to talk about that with China we have systemic differences. They don't want to be democratic and we don't want to be communist. So we are clearly on two very different paths. That said, with the Paris Agreement, and when Xi Jinping and signed the Paris, or Trump rejects the Paris Agreement, if I came back into it, there's political reason for it. But beyond that, there are issues that are important to Europe that Europe kind of carries the flag for, that are important for the entire world. Can't we talk more about a European identity and gather people around this idea or this project without being too divisive? And saying that, yes, we can defend the idea of the individual, but there are some of our countries that have kind of weakened that idea. But there are some, since we have some issues that really gather a consensus or gather people around the issue, we should not rather focus on those. I agree, because since Europe today is not a great military power, it is a great normative power and also uses the markets well. And so we can use those two avenues to work to save the planet and work in favor of the environment. In contrast to China, I gave a pretty dark picture of the United States, but within that generality, there are a few states, such as California, that are willing to work with businesses to enact policy changes, environmentally positive policy changes. So we can see that in the world of tomorrow, there can be divisiveness because of the internet managed by different bodies, but that's not in everyone's best economic interest. So it behooves the EU to discuss and have dialogues with the EU, with the United States and other states to advance, for instance, this regulating the internet, which it hasn't always done or always done as much as it could. In this case, Rachel, do you think that the Franco-German friendship cannot serve as leverage? Because we saw that when we had Merkel and Macron together, when they greeted the Chinese leader, that sort was a powerful image. I remember when Jacques Chirac sent me to Iraq after the US invasion. Remember, Mexico, Canada, and China and India were the four countries that were in agreement with us against the invasion of Iraq. I remember what really struck me after that trip. Remember that Chirac at the time had the courage to stand up against the US, but at the time people kept talking about Chirac and Schroeder, the duo, the tandem, because it was a Franco-German alliance against the US. So when France and Germany can agree on something, it really reverberates throughout the world. And so I think that that is a considerable leverage that we can use in our favor. How do you see that in Strasbourg? And I agree, yes. I must say that the French and Germans are very different. You started 5 minutes early, so I would say that you're very Germanic in your behavior today. But when there was a bridge, I remember that when the bridge over the Rhine between the two countries was inaugurated, it was inaugurated without without the two national representatives having ever met each other, because the Germans were there ahead of time, gave their speech, and then the French arrived later. So they're on two different time clocks. But I think that in terms of what you're saying, yes, you're right. They can work together. And a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron even widened that circle, that tandem, to include Mario Draghi from Italy. And so the three of them banded together when they went to Ukraine. So yes, I think that that Franco-German axis is important. And it also keep in mind that it's not a given, because the World War II is far in the past for young people, and also the idea of Eastern Germany is far in the past as well. So all of these we see also that we have to be careful about that, and also the idea of digitalization, because I agree that data is going to be important in the future. And also we passed two laws on regulating platforms, and another one that is going to be very important for the world, and also the importance of handling data about terrorists in Europe, which is very important, because we see that that feeds the circulation of hate and hatred of others that is very dangerous, and that goes against the principles of respecting others, and we need to stop it. There's another text that's called DSA, which deals with creating, obliging big platforms to not be the only holders of data, because when only one large entity controls data, they can data that affects your life, your opinions, your family, well, they can have huge consequences. So we have seen that we need to instill a sort of framework, and when it comes to digital material, and we can be at the forefront, and also our legislation can serve as an example for others. To conclude our first round table, sir, you are a professor at Columbia University. What can you tell us about the young generation in the US? How do they see the world today? Is that going in a worrisome direction, or does it make sense? I should say that at Columbia University, I have students from all over the world: Africa, China, Germany, the United States, Colombia, etc. And what's great is that this is a tiny UN in the good sense of the term. They want to change the world for the better. They're very optimistic. They have they're positive, and they're willing to do that. There where I might be a little bit more, I have less direct experience, but I have been able to observe American youth, is that a lot of young people are a bit jaded when it comes to the political system. A lot of people want to be successful in life, but they don't necessarily adhere in a big political idea as a vector of change. I don't think that that is something that a lot of young people believe in today. And maybe that also is in line with the changes in the world today. Young people are more interested in what a new, what a startup company has done with the, an internet startup company has done. Politics and economics are not big issues or that are not very important to young people. And I think that is also in line with European youth also. Thank you very much, Jean-Marie and Fabien Klemer. Remember that politics was created to create a framework and rules to fight against terrorism. So when we get away from politics, well, we go nearer to, we approach terrorism. So you can see that one of the issues that kept coming up is that how can politics, in the most noble sense of the term, how can that become something that is attractive? How can it build bridges and create and connect people? Yet, once again, because obviously in order to achieve peace, which is so important. So now you will be able to meet, break bread, and